great question to start us off with, which is you're going to use the critical power test, and you're not going to get lactate numbers because unfortunately we're out of lactate strips. So instead, it's just the blood glucose response. Sorry about that, guys. As you'd suspect, it goes from low to really high, and then when you're doing an active recovery, it's going to come down a bit more. But yeah, you're just going to be looking at the blood glucose response. And if you guys want to do a critical power test or Wingate and look at your own blood glucose response, just let me know and we can schedule out a time for you guys to come in and do it. But we're obviously going to talk about active versus passive recovery, why we care about lactate levels, and what we need to do in order to make sure that it's not going to be something that's holding back our performance. So we left off talking about the joys of overtraining syndrome, something we don't want to really get into if we can ever help it. And it turns out, like anything else, if we're applying too much stress and our athletes are not able to go ahead and, communicate with us, we don't have a good way of tracking the athletes, we can really have ourselves some major issues. And it's not just with lack of performance, but then congratulations, now we're talking about beating someone down so far that they might not ever come back to that level. So notice, guys, the psychological mood states and risk of infection is going to be one of the first things you're going to go and see when we're in overreaching. Then as we're going into overtraining and overtraining syndrome, you can see how we have other levels start to decline as well. So remember, we're constantly fighting that balance between the stress we apply and our recovery. And whenever our recovery is not adequate compared to the stress, that's where we're going to run ourselves into these issues. So like anything else, we want to make sure that we're doing the best we can to track our athletes, making sure that they still have enthusiasm. And we are going to talk about the 3 H's of tracking athletes, of making sure that they have those things. So that's going to be a decent indicator that we're recovering like we should, and obviously we're feeling good. So as you'd expect, the way that we're going to get the body out of an overtraining state is we're going to do less. And this can be for weeks, months, literally have to go and do counseling because of issues you've seen with your performance decline, especially after you've maybe trusted someone to put all that effort in and get you nowhere. Now, prevention is just, let's do a periodized program. Let's make sure we're organizing it in such a way that we're giving ourselves time off. We're making sure that we're allowing ourselves to have a deload on occasion, have a taper, everything appropriate. And when it comes to prevention, making sure we're getting in enough calories, specifically carbs if we're talking about distance athletes, and protein if we're talking potentially more about strength power athletes, but also just enough calories in general. Okay, guys, if we are not giving an athlete enough calories, we're going to run ourselves into these situations because instead of having as much recovery, now we've gone and had less because we're not eating enough. So exertional rhabdomyolysis. This is not overtraining in the chronic sense. This is the overtraining as you did way too damn much in one setting. And this can literally kill you. Now, rhabdomyolysis is the actual destruction of skeletal muscle fibers. Now, this is usually due to really strenuous exercise, typically in individuals that are a little bit dehydrated and they're effectively a little detrained, but they used to be at a much higher level. So they still know how to psychologically push themselves very far, but physiologically, their body's downregulated and not able to deal with it. So it is going to be similar to delayed onset muscle soreness, as in it's going to be something that shows up afterwards. You literally can have situations where people are essentially peeing brown. This is where we've had so much rhabdo that all those proteins inside of your muscle, are now in your bloodstream and punching holes effectively in your kidneys to get out of you. And that is literally going to possibly cause acute kidney failure, and once again, can be lethal. There's been a number of athletes that have been hospitalized for this, specifically Division I athletes. There was an example at Iowa that happened because the head coach wanted the strength coach to really mess up the athletes because they came back in January out of shape. And I think it was something like 10 athletes were put in the hospital. There's 20 or so that had rhabdo from a workout. Don't get me wrong, it was a very hard workout he had them do, but they were also, once again, detrained. They weren't as ready for it. And that strength coach did a great job of keeping their mouth shut and then became the highest paid strength coach in all of college sports. So current grads. Meanwhile, I know of 2 different coaches that were told the same thing, to mess up the athletes, to punish them with exercise, induced rhabdo in a couple of them, and they all got canned. They had to go somewhere else. So, like anything else, let's be smart. Let's make sure that we're starting off easier than we probably think so we can see where athletes are at. And then we slowly titrate up our intensities as we get closer to the actual competitions we care about. So, any questions over effectively the basics of what rhabdo is? Now, the signs and symptoms is going to be obviously a lot of muscle aches. You're going to be very weak. And then once again, that brown urine. Now, this doesn't happen, thankfully, very frequently. And if you go to the gym and you're really sore the next day, that's not going to be rhabdo. This is going to be far, far worse. But once again, this is where we've done an excessive amount of exercise. And specifically, we're usually talking about eccentric because we've gone through and done a bunch of lifting that obviously there's a lowering component that's where we're doing all that major intramuscular damage. We want to do enough of it, but remember when we talk about that relationship, we can always do more. And this is that doing more to the point at which where we've done catastrophic damage. Because here's the thing, even if you don't accidentally kill them from renal failure, congratulations, those muscle fibers that remember we try to hypertrophy them and get them bigger with time, they're gone. You now have less muscle fibers to hypertrophy in the first place. And so now you've, congratulations, limited yourself even further. Yes, rhabdomyolysis, okay? So myo being the word for muscle, lysis being the word for death. And, you know, rhabdo, if I remember correctly, that is going to be more of a line from exertion. Oh, sorry, Rod. And who said Latin didn't have a use? Now, with good, intelligent programming, we want to have a taper, okay? We want to have a point where we're going to decrease our volume and intensity. So we're going to allow ourselves to be completely prepared to give our best efforts. So, hey, KA, we're going to taper for a major competition. This could be as brief as 4 days to as long as a month. Now, the athletes that need the simple 4-day, now we're talking about more ranked beginners, maybe some intermediates. But once we're starting about talking about like elite level athletes, you know, masters of their sport, we can see tapers that literally are going to last 3 to 4 weeks. So this is important when we know when the competitions are going to be. So tapering is great when we're looking at sports like anything that is effectively barbell lifting, or we're going to be looking at something like track and field cross country. You know when the events are going to be. So because of this, we can effectively program out and make sure we hit that taper appropriately before the major competition. Now, when we see a reduction in training intensity and volume, a good rule of thumb to go with is going to be to decrease your overall volume or intensity to about 60% of its normal, possibly even less than that. So you can really make sure that we're going to resolve any potential fatigue. And so this is going to be mostly related to the fact that we're going to have maximal glycogen levels because we're not effectively doing enough work to really deplete them. And we're going to be probably maintaining our normal diet. And our sarcomeres, all of them are going to be able to be fully restored. And true like sarcomeric repair maximally takes about a full week to really get back to where you were as far as if you go ahead and don't induce any damage. Now, we're used to obviously having a certain amount of turnover. That doesn't mean you should only train once a week. That's more or less, if you're trying to be optimal, then that's why we got to take some time off. And it changes based upon the size of the individual. Usually people like super heavyweights require longer tapers. Smaller athletes and lighter weight classes don't need near as long. So this is not going to result in a decrease in your VO2 max and your performance. So we're not detraining the athlete. Instead, what we're going to do is get an improvement in overall performance because we allow our athletes to fully resolve this fatigue. Now, like anything else, the research out there still needs to be further developed, but you can see significant improvements as long as you're hitting that taper appropriately. Now, when we are not training as hard as we should, this is where we're going to get ourselves into what is known as detraining. So this is going to be where we're starting to lose, so it's reversibility, those physical aspects that we trained so far for. Now, obviously, how much we're going to be losing is going to be depending on how long we're detraining for. So like anything else, tapering, that's that up to a month. Detraining is now spending a couple weeks and months of not training as hard as we did before. And like anything else, the body doesn't like to be in shape. It takes effort and energy to effectively put in or to have a greater amount of muscle mass and all of the different improvements into your proteomics and metabolomics. So body's going to effectively try to get rid of this stuff as quickly, bingo, as it can. Now, it's going to, of course, come down to, are we just talking about not working out? Are we talking about being in a cast? So if you're in a cast, now we're talking about you can have literally performance decrements day by day. If you're still moving around, but you're not lifting weights, you're not running, you're not doing all the other types of training, your losses are going to be a little bit slower. I'm a big fan of Vladimir Shurin's work in block periodization, where you figure if you're not really training hard, but you're still training, you're probably going to lose about 5% of your max strength or aerobic capacity in about a month of no longer really working on it. Now, obviously, 5% of 100 pounds doesn't mean much, but if you think about 5% of somebody that can squat 500, that's a pretty big drop. That's losing 25 pounds on the max. That's going to hurt a lot of people's egos. Now, if we're talking about power, so vertical jump, max speed, that's going to go down in about a week of not training it. And then anaerobic endurance, so think about shuttle runs and otherwise, now we're talking about something that's going to be a little bit more akin to losing about 5% in about 2 weeks. So part of it is our muscles are going to be smaller. Part of it is we're not going to be as good at utilizing our nervous system. And it turns out, because the body is constantly trying to build and break down, or it's constantly trying to break down everything and build it as well, that we're going to have a greater amount of degradation. So if we're still doing something, we're not going to be detraining as quickly. However, if we're not really working out that hard anymore, then we can have some major decrements. So see what we got here, guys, when we're coming to specifically with aerobic performance. So you're going to see after only 2 weeks, we've decreased succinate dehydrogenase, where that's the citric acid cycle enzyme concentration, and drastically decreased our cytochrome oxidase. So that's from the electron transport chain. Meanwhile, VO2 max hasn't really moved much, but notice once we get to 4 weeks, now we're going to start to see a much greater decrement in those overall ability to utilize oxygen for performance. Now, glycogen storage is also going to be going down because of, once again, no longer training, so the body doesn't need to hold on to as much. And like anything else, because of we're not having to deal with all that lactate, we are not trying to develop more monocarboxylate transporters and everything else related to helping us with effectively removal of that lactate, decreasing bicarbonate, which in turn is going to mean we're going to have a greater amount of lactic acid or lactate being produced, which that pH, that wonderful proton that comes with it, is going to cause our pH to rapidly decline. So you guys can see how effectively after these number of weeks, you see the lactate levels going up, the pH levels going down, and then our bicarbonate levels as well is going down, and the overall swim performance of these athletes also effectively staying about the same. It's not really changing too much at that point, but like anything else, it's important to know that these biomarkers will effectively eventually lead to an overall decrease in performance. So like anything else, training only gives you a little bit of increase in performance. Let's be honest. The amount of months you have to put in of resistance training, endurance training, otherwise, to make relatively small progress, especially when you're dealing with very highly trained individuals, is pretty slight. However, it's going to be that same type of slight losses you're going to get once we're no longer training like we were. So we're going to see changes in obviously our form and skill, and mobility is going to go ahead and go downhill. And that's why it's important to make sure that we're still trying to have not just the strength component, not just the conditioning component, but the mobility component always in our program so that we're effectively challenging the body through all of those markers. And yes, like I made mention before, max speed and acceleration is going to go down pretty rapidly in about a week if we're not doing anything to essentially maintain it. So bed rest studies are really fascinating in that they'll take individuals, go ahead and pay them to lay in bed for 3 weeks, not getting up to do anything. They effectively, someone almost helps them get up so they can go use the bathroom and lay back down. Notice, guys, where after that good old 3 weeks, and this is for the 5 individuals that did it, the ones that were in poor aerobic shape in the first place didn't really lose as much. And if anything, they were able to surpass their previous levels pretty quickly. Meanwhile, notice the individual in purple. After that 3 weeks off, 60 days later, they've only barely gotten back to where they were beforehand. So after 2 months of training to go back to where they were. So therein lies one of the major issues, which is when it comes to detraining an athlete, the longer you take off, you can almost more than double the amount of time that it's going to take to get back, which obviously can be pretty rough because now we're talking about almost handcuffing yourself to your training in order to keep allowing yourself to move forward and make progress. So the good news is, how often do you really need to train in order to avoid these losses of conditioning? We're really only talking about a decrease of essentially 2/3. Okay, so as long as we're doing half of our normal volume or 2/3 of our normal volume or above, we're going to do a good job of maintaining our current performance. So we don't necessarily need to do maximal training once a week. Instead, it's like, okay, we just need to go out there and at least hit some decent intensities, volumes, etc., compared to what we're normally used to. And we should do a pretty good job of at least maintaining our previous performance. And that's fine because max strength in a cross-country athlete, max endurance in a shot putter isn't that important. But having a decent enough aerobic base that they can go ahead and throw the shot more frequently and having good enough strength numbers so that they're going to have that kick at the end of the race and they're not going to get hurt as much, that's a good thing. But when we're in season, let's go ahead and effectively apply that minimal dose to maintain our levels of performance, if not slightly stair-step it up. Let's not worry about training maximally. Anyone can train maximally, and that's just dumb. The goal is to train optimally. So once you get into space, and we're talking about astronauts and cosmonauts, which is really fascinating because of individuals that effectively are out there, what you're going to see due to the lack of gravity, you're going to see a massive decrease in muscle mass and overall strength, specifically the muscles that keep you upright, because they no longer have to fight against gravity all day long. And our individual fibers are going to shrink. And what's interesting is we start to see more of a preference towards type 2 if we're being completely sedentary. Now, if individuals are actually out there exercising, moving around, well, now we've got ourselves a situation where effectively the stroke volume has improved, but our total work capacity is going to be going massively down, okay? Because of effectively not having the effects of gravity and all the pumping and moving, what we're going to see is, in general, our total blood volume is going to go down, which is going to be useful effectively when we're in space. However, you're not going to have the same advantage when it comes to obviously on Earth. And so if you're talking about space flight and putting humans on Mars, it's very important that those folks are going to be effectively exercising, because if they're not exercising, well, whenever they get to the planet, they're on their own. And if they don't have the basic, essentially motor abilities to exercise, move around, and do work, then congratulations. Now, effectively, you are going to be effectively useless, and most people around you aren't going to have the reserves to take care of you because you're physically so detrained. And so it's wild when they look at some of the detraining studies. They will literally pay people to lay in bed for 2 or 3 months, which is just, I mean, it'll be like 20 grand. So it's a pretty good amount, but like anything, I mean, how much would someone have to pay you to not leave your bed? You don't get to go on, mind you, God, that sounds a lot like quarantine and COVID, doesn't it? but you're still not allowed to go work out. You're not allowed to go for a walk. You just got to lay down all day, every day, and someone picks you up to go to use the bathroom. Yeah. They're actually typically they're looking for, so like you guys heard like type A and type B personalities. They're looking for people that are like type C, which are like typically the laziest people you're ever going to meet, because those are the ones that'll actually do it. Most other folks at some point will be like, I need to go for a walk, or I need to go do something. And, at some point you mentally break, which obviously this pandemic has shown a lot of people. Their point of breaking was maybe a little bit further away than they thought it would be. But at the same time, we're all getting through it. So what questions do you guys have about the joys of adapting to sport and sport performance? All right, folks, I want you guys to go ahead and put 3 different sports up into the chat. All right, sounds good. So we got softball, volleyball, and water polo. Curtis, I appreciate your offer or option, but you're a little late to the party. Okay, so in your groups, spelling. We're gonna have you break down components. So we're talking about strength, power, endurance, mobility, etc. Okay, needed to be developed, and effectively, once you know what you need to develop, which hint, it's going to be everything, but obviously to sport specific actions, I want you guys to then figure out how you would prioritize over a full year developing each of them, from the off season to the preseason, in season, and then postseason. Okay. And effectively, what's going to hit the back burner when? Because figure certain sports, playing the sport itself is going to effectively maintain certain aspects of athletic performance, but the sports don't have other components that we're looking to go ahead and try to maintain. So effectively think about when we're really trying to push, when we're just trying to effectively maintain, and then effectively how much are we really trying to taper. So group 1 is softball, group 2 is volleyball, and group 3 is water polo. It's really hard on the horses. So it's 1:48 right now. Got that up now, posted into the chat for you guys to see. And we will plan on meeting back here effectively at about 2 o'clock. So you're gonna have to look up when, like, what's the competition season like for these sports? How long are these competition seasons? And then from there, okay, what metabolic systems are we really stressing when we happen to be effectively in season? What metabolic systems are maybe being neglected by the sport when we're in season? And you figure speed and power are going to be taken care of to a certain extent in season, but think about what part of your metabolic systems are maybe being a little neglected potentially, or are we focusing more on strength, mobility, etc. And what are we going to prioritize in the off season, preseason, and in season? Remember, strength and endurance have the longest residuals. The shortest is anaerobic power and speed. So whenever you guys are ready, we've got the rooms open. We're going to meet back at, once again, 2 o'clock. Have fun. All right. Good. You probably want to taper everything as we're getting like to like the actual like tournament play at the very end, because whatever you got at that point, you're going to got let it ride. But otherwise, what you guys are putting out there for softball is pretty good. Now, yes, and then also think about metabolically, softball is much more taxing for the pitchers and catchers than it is for the other position players. So your actual like cardiovascular endurance and even anaerobic endurance is going to be pretty low demands for the sport, really. But the cardiovascular demands to replenish the ATP PCR after every pitch is going to be a bit higher for them. So making sure that we have enough there. You'd probably also try to push muscle mass in the off season and maintain it in the in season. And then, yeah, making sure that they're not falling off, because there's not much of conditioning aspect to that sport. Okay. Yeah. And good, Abby. So really trying to maintain that strength and mostly really that power on the in season. Once again, maybe try to push that muscle mass a little bit more in the off season. As far as the conditioning component, think about now that sport has got obviously a bit more of a conditioning component than obviously softball does, but even then it's still not that great. So that's one of those things you'd probably have more in the back burner of just trying to maintain while they're in the season, just because depending on the position and roles, they might not actually get a lot of cardiovascular stress on them as they're going through. So yeah, it is one of those things that you're probably always going to be trying to emphasize one or the other, but think about when we're going more long-term programming, we have our hypertrophy phase, strength phase, power phase, and then back to the beginning. So that's going to be our greatest volumes, lowest intensities, and then we finish at our highest intensities and our lowest volumes. And so when we're trying to, maintain in the in season, trying to avoid that detraining, we're going to go ahead and try to make sure we set up programming appropriately. So last but not least, okay. So now when you bring up the sport of water polo, I kind of have an advantage here because I actually played it growing up. And let me tell you, you don't get out of shape while you're playing water polo, because the true water polo is in an all deep pool. So even when you're not playing, you're still treading water because of horses. I like it. So yeah, that's okay. And that's why we have the power of Google's to look into it. So the strength component, all you got to do is move against water, and then you do fight other human beings. I'll tell you stories if you're ever interested. But effectively, it has elements of soccer and basketball, but then also at certain points wrestling. Now, like anything else, the strength is the component that can easily kind of fall off the backside, and then power is being worked pretty hard just by the nature of the sport, since you're going to have power demands in all the sports we talked about, but still having those two. And then in season, I would cut back all conditioning, because if you're playing, you're playing. We don't have a question of whether or not you're in shape. There's pretty much no way that you can get around it. Yeah, if we could get in an all deep pool, or like over an alumni pool, and I could teach you guys how to play, and you're not allowed to use floaties or a life preserver, you'd understand that it does not take very long for you to be exhausted. But the fear of drowning will keep anybody treading water a little bit longer than they'd probably prefer. So not bad, guys, not bad. We're just trying to like think our way through, obviously, what we're doing. If we're thinking about something simple like cross country, then yeah, that's where we're going to cut back on the power and the strength training when we're in season. And the conditioning takes care of itself. That is the sport. If we're working with that shot put or thrower, well, we're going to cut back the conditioning in season to maybe just doing that once a week. And then, yeah, we still have a strength training, and the power is the actual throwing that they're doing anyways. So some sports are really simple. Obviously, these sports have a little bit more dynamic demands, but still thinking our way through, okay, how do we progress the training? What can we allow to fall off the back of the bus? And we're still going to be doing pretty good overall with our athletes. So do we have any other questions about what we just did before we're going to do one more little group setup? Do we have anything else that you guys would like to cover? Okay, so the last thing we're going to do is I'm going to introduce to you guys a concept that I like to use when we're working with athletes, and that's going to be referred to as a radar plot. Okay, so let's go ahead. And I want a couple circles. My sister is the artist. Bear with me, folks. So this is just a real quick and easy drawing here. So, agreed. Now, the basic idea here, guys, is if we're working with a given sport, and I want you guys, we're going to put you back into your own group and then think about how you would go ahead and effectively try to set up your own variation on this with the athlete that you have. And so the basic idea here is, let's see if I can move this around a little bit. There you go. Yeah, this is special. Very special. But I'm trying, guys. I promise I'm trying. Okay. So we have all of these circles that I've drawn very poorly. Okay. Going out from the smallest circle to obviously the largest circle. Now, the outermost areas is just absolute Fruit Loops levels of strength. Okay. The innermost being relatively low. Okay. So let's go ahead and Homer Simpson lives in here. He doesn't need a lot of coordination. He doesn't really need any agility, any mobility, any endurance, END, any power, any coordination. He can use Grubhub and everything else to get all the food delivered to him. He can use Meyer or whatever delivery to get all the other things. He just doesn't have to do anything. Now, if you're dealing with, say, a power lifter, you need to be as strong as physically possible. From there, power actually doesn't really matter. Mobility, you just need enough mobility to squat. Endurance, nope, you just need to be able to waddle up to the rack and hit the weight. Coordination, well, you need to be sober enough to actually be able to grab the barbell and hold it. And then agility, nope, we do not need to worry about changing direction. And then once again, we need as much strength as humanly possible. Okay, so it looks nice and ugly like that. Now, what I want you guys to do in your group of 3, think about a sport and what levels you need of each of these. So when we talk about power, maximal power, this would be, the greatest level of this would be like an Olympic lifter, where you just have insane power to body weight ratio. Mobility, over here would be a contortionist. Okay, endurance, now we're talking about a marathoner. Okay, that thing's an ultra marathoner. So that thing's as peaked out as far as it can be. Coordination, and obviously super high levels of coordination in things that aren't sports. I would use the example of something like golf, billiards, darts, archery, etc. And then agility being the ability to change direction rapidly and change movements. So think about ultra high level like parkour individuals, or you can look at competitive tag because that now exists again. So think about your sport, and on a scale for 1 to 10, where would you rank each of these components for the sports you guys are given, or you guys come up with? Could be basketball, baseball, soccer, softball, Quidditch, I don't care. But your groups are open again, but think about which of those individual elements we need. It's 211, plan on coming back at about 213, 214. So come up with something quick, we'll shoot from the hips, and then we'll go through and see what we came up with. All right, folks, whenever you guys are ready, go ahead and paste into the chat what you guys came up with for the sports you chose, and then the levels of development you'd like to see in each of them.
Can I just talk about mine instead of typing it? Because I don't really have anything typed up.
Go for it.
Okay. Well, we were group one and we chose cross country just because I felt like that would be really easy for me to talk about. Obviously your endurance is going to be really, really high. Probably not. I mean, for me specifically, it's not going to be like in the outer ring because I'm not a marathon runner, but it's going to be
Hmm.
pretty close. Coordination and agility, you really don't have to be either to run because you're not going to turn that much and you're just running. So it could be a little lower. I'm not going to say it's like in the inner circle, but it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be that much.
Hmm.
Um, Strength and power, I would say maybe like 50% because you do want to have strength and power to run, but you don't need that much. Maybe not 50%, but you still need some. It's important to have some, especially power for like starts and finishes because you want to
Hmm.
get like a good starting position, and obviously you want to have enough power to finish strong. And mobility, it honestly can be different. I've seen a lot of cross country athletes that absolutely suck at mobility, but I'm really like flexible personally, so
Hmm.
I don't think that has a big like impact on whether or not you're good. I think it's just if you work on it, then you'll be good at it. It probably is way better for injury prevention in cross country,
Hmm.
but I don't really think that it's like the utmost importance to be working on.
Absolutely. So right there, you've got a lot of gems to parse apart. So yeah, obviously endurance is the sport. You need enough coordination that you can run across the field and not turn an ankle, enough agility that you can make the turns that you need to on the courses, and or avoid like a little, tree branch, root, the things that happen there. But you don't need that much stuff. Now from there, strength, yeah, you just need to be strong enough to be able to move your own body. So that's strength relative to your body weight as opposed to like absolute strength. And it doesn't need to be too crazy. Same thing, power. We don't necessarily need to be able to jump up and headbutt the rim, but we do need to make sure that we at least, can turn it on when we need to. Mobility is a great point because the injury avoidance, okay? We don't want to have just enough to be doing well in our sport, but we also need to think about which of these components, if we have higher, well, it turns out we're gonna be that much less likely to be injured. If you're stronger and a more mobile and more agile and more coordinated long distance runner, you're probably less likely to get hurt than if you, for lack of a better term, we think about video games, dumped all of your stats into endurance. Now, another thing to keep in mind from there, which is I like this graph as a way to kind of contextualize your training of your own athletes. So let's say we had that power lifter and we wanted them to go be a cross country runner. Like, well, oh darn, we know we are missing all of that endurance and that needs to get worked on. Mobility is probably good enough. Agility, coordination might be good enough, and strength and power by the nature of the beast are probably so much higher than we need. Then we can just put all of our emphasis into building endurance, and then we can put the rest of the stuff on the back burner. And obviously, the opposite could be true. Now, group two with the tennis, yeah, good point with being well rounded. Now, I would argue the power is going to be, yeah, it's kind of hard to think about when like you think about throwing velocity and serving velocity compared to like Olympic lifting, but obviously your goal there is to be very powerful. So if you have such a powerful serve that no one can ever return anything you hit, then we don't really have to worry about agility and everything else as much. Mind you, yes, I know the other side is going to serve at some point. So we need to think about, yes, which of these would we try to optimize? And absolutely, coordination needs to be pretty high. Agility, because there's a lot of change of direction. Strength, yeah, just need to have decent relative body and yeah, a little bit of everything effectively overall. Endurance, maybe a little bit lower, but yeah, that's still a good job. Now with basketball, I would say coordination is okay. Yeah, no, that works out well then. Where I would think mobility depends on position. Like your average point guard is going to be more mobile than your forward, and how mobile you really need to be to play basketball as a forward is really not that great. But having that coordination, maybe not that high of agility, but notice I was already parsing it down by positional role, and you still have you got a good accord. Power probably not necessarily that high either, but notice you just need a really well-rounded athlete for the most part when we're talking about obviously working with a basketball player. And then same thing with the tennis player, with arguably a little bit more on coordination and maybe even a little bit less on endurance, simply because, yes, it still has metabolic demands, but it's not as nonstop as basketball can be. But remember, context is always key. If we were to go and try to turn Colleen into a basketball player, well, now we need to start building her strength and her power and definitely that coordination, aka the technical side of the sport. She's got endurance for days and more than enough mobility to play the sport, so that can get thrown immediately onto the back burner. But it's just a way to help you prioritize what's going to be the most important things that your athlete is lacking, and then having benchmarks, because right now these are arbitrary numbers. This is qualitative, which I hate. It's going to be quantitative. So maybe our strength benchmark for that athlete in that sport is a 2 times body weight squat. So if they're a 100-pound athlete, they got to squat 200 pounds. They weigh 200 pounds, they got to squat 400. Pretty simple and straightforward. This is how strong you need to be. Power, this could be something along the lines of just a straight up vertical jump. It needs to be this many inches. And so we at least have those ways of just essentially seeing, have we hit our benchmarks? Have we hit our thresholds? And then what are we going to prioritize in the programming to get them where they need to be? So I am sorry I have gone way over, guys. You guys stay safe out there. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you guys for talking through lab on Friday. If you guys want to do the long, hard ride to nowhere and see your glucose response, and we'll have you just do the critical power test when you do that. It's 3 minutes all out against half the resistance of the Wingate, but it's miserable. But you're more than welcome to come in and do that. So take care of yourselves, guys. Stay safe out there, and I will see you guys on Friday. Bye-bye.